They'll kill me if they find me, the girl whispered, pressing herself against the cold brick wall, her whole body shaking so hard her teeth were clicking together like a broken engine. Ethan Blake stood in that freezing alley and looked at a teenage girl who was terrified of something he couldn't see, and he gave her everything he had left, his last $20 and his father's coat. He thought it was just kindness. He had no idea it was the first move in a war that had been waiting for him his entire life. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you are watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The night Ethan Blake walked home without his coat was the same night his whole life changed direction, though he wouldn't understand that for another 6 days. He had closed the shop later than usual because the Hendersons' truck had taken twice as long as he'd quoted, and he wasn't the kind of man who sent a vehicle back onto the road before he was sure it was safe. That was the thing about Ethan. He had always been careful with other people's things, even when nobody was being careful with his. Billings, Montana in late November doesn't ease into cold. It hits you like a door swinging open in a meat locker flat and final, and without any apology. The temperature had dropped to 7 degrees Celsius by the time Ethan locked the front gate of the shop, and he pulled his father's old coat tighter across his chest, the brown canvas one, with the cracked leather collar that his father had worn every winter from 1987 until the day the man had died. Ethan had worn it ever since, not because it was warm enough, which it barely was, but because it still smelled faintly of his father's pipe tobacco and the motor oil that never quite washed out of anything in their family. He had $20 in his wallet. That was it until Friday. He'd paid the shop's electric bill that afternoon, the one that was already 12 days past due, and the math had worked out to exactly $20 remaining. He knew the number precisely because he'd counted it twice in the parking lot of the utility office, standing in the cold, making sure he hadn't miscounted. He hadn't. He was 3 blocks from his apartment when he heard something in the alley behind the old pharmacy on Mead Avenue. It wasn't a loud sound. It was the opposite. It was the sound of someone trying very hard not to make any sound at all. A small scrape of shoe against concrete. A breath pulled in too sharp. The specific silence of a living thing pressed against a wall and praying to become invisible. Ethan stopped walking. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, listening the kind of listening his father had taught him, not just with your ears, but with the back of your neck, with the skin on your forearms. He'd grown up hunting. He knew the difference between an animal moving and an animal hiding. Whatever was in that alley was hiding. He should have kept walking. He knew that. He knew it the same way you know you shouldn't reach into a box if you can't see the bottom. But Ethan Blake had a problem that had plagued him his entire 43 years on this earth. And that problem was that he could not walk past something in distress. It was wired into him somewhere below, logic below self-preservation. His ex-wife Sandra had called it a gift. She'd also in the same breath called it the reason she couldn't plan a future with him, because a man who stops for every stray dog and every stranger in trouble is a man who will always be broke and always be late and always be giving away things he can't afford to give. She hadn't been wrong. She just hadn't been able to love him for it. He turned into the alley. She was pressed against the brick wall about 15 feet and crouched low, with her arms wrapped around herself, wearing a thin hoodie that was completely wrong for the temperature. Young 16, maybe 17, maybe younger. Dark hair, dark eyes that caught the ambient light from the street behind him and went absolutely wide with terror the second she saw him step into the alley mouth. She sucked in a breath to scream. "Whoa," Ethan said, immediately holding both hands up, palms out, the universal "I'm not a threat" gesture that you hope works when you really need it to work. "I'm not gonna hurt you. I heard you and I wanted to make sure you were okay." She didn't scream, but she didn't relax either. She pressed herself harder against the bricks like she was trying to push through them, and her eyes darted past him to the alley entrance, checking the street behind him with the rapid practice scan of someone who had spent the last several hours being afraid. "I'm alone," he said. "I'm just a mechanic. My shop's 2 blocks that way. I'm nobody." "Please leave," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Please just go. Pretend you didn't see me." "I can't really do that," he said, and he was already taking a slow step toward her, the way you'd approach a deer you'd found tangled in a fence, careful. No sudden movements, keeping your body sideways so you look smaller. "It's 7 degrees out here. You don't have a coat. That's not a situation I can just walk past." "You don't understand." Her eyes darted to the alley entrance again. They'll kill me if they find me. The words landed in the cold air between them and sat there stark and specific. Not the kind of thing a teenager said for drama. The kind of thing a person said because it was the literal truth and they needed another human being to hear it and take it seriously. Ethan took it seriously. "Who's looking for you?" he asked, keeping his voice low and level. "I can't tell you that." She shook her head hard. "I can't tell you anything. You have to go. If they see you talking to me, they'll just go, please." He studied her for a moment. She was shaking badly, and it wasn't all fear her lips had taken on the faint bluish tinge that meant her body was losing the temperature battle. She'd been out here for a while, long enough to be genuinely at risk. Ethan made the kind of decision that took no deliberation whatsoever, which was the only kind he trusted. He reached into his wallet and pulled out the $20 both bills, a 10 and a 10, and held them out to her. She stared at the money like it was something she didn't quite recognize. "Take it," he said. "There's a 24-hour diner on 2nd Avenue, the Sunrise. It's about 6 blocks east. You can sit in there all night and they won't bother you. Order coffee, keep ordering coffee. It'll keep you warm and it'll give you a reason to stay." She didn't take the money yet. "Why are you doing this?" "Because you're cold and you're scared and someone should help you," he said simply. "Go on, take it." Her hand came out slowly and took the bills, and then she was folding them into her fists like they might disappear if she held them loosely. He was already taking off his father's coat. She blinked. "What are you? No, I can't take your coat." "You're not dressed for this temperature," he said, shaking it off his shoulders, feeling the immediate assault of the cold through his flannel shirt and the thermal layer underneath. "I'm 3 blocks from home. I'll jog it." That's your coat. I can see that's not a coat you just give someone. It's a coat that needs to be on someone who needs it more than I do right now," he said, and he stepped forward carefully and held it out to her. "Please." She looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him the way people look at other people when they're trying to calculate if trust is going to get them killed. He let her look. He stood still and he let her read whatever she needed to read in his face, and whatever she found there must have been enough because she reached out and took the coat. She pulled it around her shoulders. It was enormous on her. It had been built for his father, who had been a broad man, and Ethan had filled it out but just barely, and this girl was slight and young, and it swallowed her whole. She pulled it tight across her chest, and something in her face shifted. Not all the way to safe, but a couple of degrees closer to it. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Harper." "I'm Ethan. The shop with the blue sign on Route 3 is mine if you ever need anything." He took a small step backward, giving her space, giving her the clear path to the alley entrance. "Get to the Sunrise. Stay warm. Whatever you're running from, it can't chase you as well if you're warm and you've got coffee in you." A ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but close enough to be heartbreaking. "You're a strange man," she said. "People keep telling me that," he agreed. "Go on, Harper. Get moving before you lose any more heat." She moved past him toward the alley mouth, and for a second she paused and looked back at him, and she started to say something, and then she didn't say it, and then she was gone. Just a shape in his father's coat disappearing around the corner into the Billings night. Ethan stood in the alley for a moment in his flannel shirt and his thermal in 7 degrees of Montana winter, and then he started jogging home. He was sick by morning. It wasn't serious, he was clear about that, or at least he kept telling himself he was. A head cold, a chest cold, the kind of sick you get when you spend 20 minutes in near freezing temperatures without adequate layering, which he had objectively done. He went through half a box of tissues on Tuesday and called the shop to push back Mrs. Carlisle's oil change, which she took personally even though she had no legitimate reason to, and he spent most of the day on his couch, wrapped in a blanket, watching old games on cable, and trying not to think about how the $20 he'd given away would have bought him exactly the cold medicine he was now out of. He thought about Harper occasionally. He wondered if she'd made it to the Sunrise. He wondered if the people she was afraid of had found her, and he pushed that thought away every time it came because there was nothing he could do about it, and dwelling on it served no purpose. By Thursday, he was well enough to go back to the shop, and the work piled on him immediately the way it always did after even a brief absence because Ethan ran his operation lean. Just him and his part-time assistant, Denny, who was 19 and competent, but not yet confident, which meant most of the judgment calls still landed on Ethan's desk. He worked through Thursday and into the evening, and he was elbow deep in a transmission when Denny came to the open bay door and said with the particular tone of someone who wasn't sure what they were looking at, "Ethan, there are some motorcycles out front." Ethan didn't look up immediately. "How many?" "Like, a lot of motorcycles," Denny said. He looked up then. Through the bay door and past the glass of the office windows, he could see them pulling into the lot one after another, a procession of iron and leather and chrome that took up every inch of the parking area and extended out onto the shoulder of the road. The engines were big and American, and they made the kind of sound that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. The riders were uniformly large, uniformly leather-vested, and they were not the kind of men who required a second look to understand that they operated outside of most conventional social frameworks. Denny was 19. His voice was admirably steady when he said, "Should I call someone?" "No," Ethan said. "Go wait in the office." "Ethan." "Denny, office? Lock the door if you want to." He was already wiping his hands on the shop rag. "I'll handle it." He stepped out of the bay. There were at least 20 bikes. Maybe more. It was hard to count them with the evening light going the way it was. They were all parked, and the engines were cutting off one by one, a staggered silence that somehow felt louder than the noise had been. The riders were dismounting, and they were big men, most of them with a particular physicality of people who have spent decades doing hard things with their bodies. Arms that belonged in a different century. Hands that had fixed things and broken things in equal measure. And on the back of every vest in bold white lettering on a red and white patch, Hell's Angels. Ethan had heard of them the way everyone in Montana had heard of them, the mythology, the reputation, the half-true stories that circulated at bars and around dinner tables. He'd never had direct contact. He stood in front of his shop in his work clothes, grease still under his fingernails, and he did not run because running would have been both useless and undignified, and Ethan Blake had a stubborn relationship with his own dignity. The man who walked toward him was in his 50s, maybe 55, maybe 60, built like a man who had never in his life thought about taking up less space. Gray hair trimmed beard, a face that had the particular weathering of someone who had spent decades outdoors doing things that weren't gentle. He moved with absolute authority, not the practiced authority of someone who'd learned it, but the natural authority of someone who had never in their life questioned whether the space they occupied was theirs to occupy. He was holding something. He was holding Ethan's father's coat. Ethan stopped walking. He hadn't meant to. His feet just stopped of their own accord because the sight of that coat in a stranger's hands hit him somewhere below his ribcage in the place where things that matter live. The man stopped a few feet away. He held the coat out, not as a threat, not as a demand, just held it there between them like a question. "This yours?" His voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who had never once in his life needed to raise it to be taken seriously. "It was my father's," Ethan said, which was both the true answer and the more complete answer. The man nodded slowly. He looked at the coat, then back at Ethan. "My daughter was wearing it when we found her." The air between them shifted. Ethan looked at the coat, the cracked leather collar, the canvas that had gone soft with 20 years of washing, and then he looked at the man and he understood in a complete and sudden way that this conversation was not going to be brief, and that the direction of his life was about to change in ways he could not yet calculate. "Is she all right?" Ethan asked. The man studied him for a long moment, the same kind of deep reading that Harper had done in the alley, the same calculation of trustworthiness, only done with decades more experience and considerably more authority behind it. "She's alive," the man said. "That's partly because of what you did." "I didn't do anything special," Ethan said. "She needed help. I helped. A lot of men would have kept walking." "I'm not a lot of men," Ethan said. Not with pride, just as a fact. The man almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely perceptible, but it was there. He extended his right hand. "William Hayes, they call me Grip." Ethan took the hand and shook it. "Ethan Blake." "I know who you are," Grip said. "Your shop, your name, your address. I know what you paid for this building and what you owe on it and how long you've been operating in the red." He said it without malice, without threat, just with the flat factual delivery of someone who had done their homework and wanted the other person to understand the scope of it. "I know your father's name was Thomas Blake and that he died 14 months ago, and that the estate didn't close the way it should have. Ethan went very still. How do you know about my father's estate? Because Grip said, and now there was something new in his voice, not quite anger, not quite grief, but the complicated territory that lives between the two. I've been looking at a lot of estates, and your father's name keeps showing up in places it has no business being. The sun had dropped behind the mountains. The parking lot was in shadow now, and the 20-odd bikers standing around their machines were absolutely motionless, watching this conversation with the focused attention of men who understood that the thing being discussed was serious. What are you talking about? Ethan said. That's a long conversation, Grip said, and it's cold out here. He held out the coat. Put this back on. You're going to need it. Ethan took the coat. He put it on slowly, feeling the familiar weight of it settle on his shoulders, and also feeling the weight of everything else Grip Hayes had just said begin to settle in his chest. My daughter told me what you did for her, Grip said. She said you didn't ask questions, didn't ask for anything. Just gave her what she needed and sent her somewhere safe. She was cold and scared, Ethan said. Seemed like the thing to do. You gave her your last $20. Ethan paused. She told you that. She tells me everything. A pause. Eventually. Something moved through Grip's expression, the complicated love of a father who has watched his child walk into danger and couldn't get there in time to stop it. What she was carrying, when you found her those documents in her bag, do you know what those were? I didn't look in her bag, Ethan said. I didn't look at anything. She was scared. I wasn't going to dig through her things. Grip's expression shifted again. This time it was clear as something that was very close to respect, though the man wore it the way someone wears a piece of clothing they're not entirely used to. No, he said slowly. I don't suppose you would have. What were the documents? Ethan asked. Grip looked at him for a long, measuring moment. Around them, the other riders had begun to shift the way large bodies shift when a decision is being made nearby and they're waiting on the outcome. Evidence, Grip said, of a system that has been stealing from people like your father for a very long time. The word people like your father landed in Ethan's chest and detonated slowly. Stealing how? Ethan said. His voice was careful now, careful in the way of someone who feels the ground shifting under them and is trying to keep their balance. Loans that didn't exist, Grip said. Signatures that weren't signed. Estates sold for 60 cents on the dollar to buyers who had agreed in advance to flip them for a profit. Families who were already grieving, who trusted the people handling their paperwork because those people were lawyers and officials and bank officers who were told the debt was real when the debt was manufactured. Ethan stood very still. My father, he said. The words came out quietly. His farm. The Blake farm outside of Roundup sold for $210,000, Grip said. Appraised value was $340. It sold to a company called Meridian Holdings LLC, which isn't a real company, it's a shell. That shell sold to a private developer 8 weeks later for $380,000. The numbers landed one after another, each one a small detonation. Ethan had been told the farm had to be sold to cover debts. He'd been told his father had borrowed against the property. He'd been shown paperwork documents with his father's signature, or something that looked like his father's signature, showing a loan from a company he didn't recognize for a sum he hadn't known about. That loan, he started to say, wasn't real, Grip said. Or if it was real, the money never went anywhere your father would have authorized. The signature on those loan documents, we had a forensic analyst look at it. It's close, but it's not right. The pen pressure is wrong. The letter formation in the T and the B don't match samples from documents your father signed himself. Ethan's jaw was tight. He could feel it, the pressure at the hinge of it, the way his teeth had come together harder than was comfortable. How long have you known this? I've been working this for 8 months, Grip said. Your father's case is one of 37 we've documented. 37 families who lost property or estate value, or both in circumstances that don't hold up to scrutiny. 37 sets of documents with problems that are invisible to a grieving family working through the worst months of their lives, but visible to someone who knows what to look for. He paused. The man at the center of this is named Daniel Carver. He runs a financial services firm out of Billings. Very legitimate looking, very well connected. Daniel Carver, Ethan said, and the name was completely unfamiliar to him, which somehow made it worse to know that a man he'd never heard of had been shaping his life without his knowledge. Harper found the internal documentation, Grip said. The kind that shows how the system actually works, the communication between Carver's people in the shell companies, the fee structures, the list of targets. That's what she was carrying when you found her in that alley. She'd copied it from a source inside Carver's organization, and she was trying to get it to us, and they realized she'd taken it, and they sent people after her. She's 17, Ethan said, and it came out sharper than he intended. I know how old she is, Grip said, and for the first time the weight of something more personal moved through his voice. Not the authority of a leader giving a briefing, but the grief of a father recounting how close he'd come to catastrophe. She was trying to help me. She got further into it than she was supposed to, and she was running, and she ended up in that alley, and you were there. And gave her my father's coat, Ethan said. And gave her your father's coat, Grip confirmed, which is how we found you, because Harper described it to me. Said the man who helped her was wearing a brown canvas coat with a cracked leather collar and a small tear at the left pocket that had been hand-stitched closed. I started looking for it. Took about 4 days, but in a city this size, a coat like that, with a repair like that, somebody's going to remember it. Ethan looked down at his left pocket. The small repair was there neat and tight, done by his mother years ago with dark brown thread that was slightly the wrong shade. He'd never noticed it enough to fix it. What do you want from me? He asked. Grip was quiet for a moment. The question sat between them in the cold air. Right now, Grip said, nothing. I came to return your coat and to tell you what it means, and to tell you that there are people who know you helped Harper, and those people are not friendly, and you should be aware of that. You're warning me, Ethan said. I'm telling you the truth, Grip said, which is what I do with people who earned it. He held Ethan's gaze. You helped my daughter when she was alone and terrified, and you didn't have anything to gain from it. You gave her money you didn't have, and a coat you couldn't replace. That buys you the truth from me, Mr. Blake. Whatever you decide to do with it is your business. He began to turn back toward his bike. Grip, Ethan said. The man stopped. This evidence Harper was carrying, Ethan said. Did she get it to you? Is it safe? Grip turned back. The expression on his face was for a moment completely unguarded, the face of a father who loves his daughter more than he will ever say in a life that has not always permitted him to say it. It's safe, he said. She got it to us. Good, Ethan said simply. They looked at each other in the near dark of the parking lot. There are some people I want you to meet, Grip said finally. Not tonight, when you're a journalist and a financial analyst who have been working this case with me. They're the ones who can tell you about your father's estate in the kind of detail that would hold up in court. A beat. If you're interested in that kind of detail, Ethan thought about the farm outside Roundup, about his father's hands, which had been rough and capable and had worked that land for 30 years, about standing at the estate lawyer's office, still numb from grief, being shown documents he didn't have the bandwidth to scrutinize, being told the numbers were what they were, being guided through a process he didn't fully understand because he trusted the people guiding him, about a loan he'd never known existed for money that had apparently never gone anywhere, real, that had cost his father's land. I'm interested, he said. Grip nodded once. He reached into the inside pocket of his vest and pulled out a card, plain white, nothing on it, but a phone number, handwritten in heavy black ink. He held it out to Ethan. Ethan took it. One more thing, Grip said. My daughter asked me to tell you something. What's that? She said the coat was warm, Grip said, and that she felt safe for the first time in 2 days when she put it on. She said to tell you that. Ethan looked down at the coat on his shoulders. The cracked leather collar, the smell of tobacco and oil that nothing had ever quite erased. Tell her I'm glad, he said. Grip walked back to his bike. The other riders moved, the coordinated movement of a group that operated together with the ease of long familiarity. Engines started one and then another, and then all of them filling the air with that low, chest-deep rumble. And then they were gone, pulling out of the lot and onto the road, a procession of lights disappearing into the Montana dark. Ethan stood in the empty parking lot and held the card in his hand and stood very still for a long time. Denny appeared at the shop door. Ethan, what the hell just happened? I'm not entirely sure, Ethan said. Were those Hell's Angels? Yes. And they just left. They left. Ethan turned the card over in his fingers. A phone number. A man named Grip who knew things about his father's estate that nobody had ever told him. A girl in an alley with documents that exposed something much larger than one dead man's stolen farm. Denny, do you still have that contact at the county recorder's office? The one who helped you with your grandfather's property tax thing. Denny blinked. Yeah, I think so. Why? I need to pull some records, Ethan said, on a property sale. My father's farm outside of Roundup. And I need to know everything that happened with that estate from the time my father died until the time the sale closed. That's public record, Denny said. Shouldn't be hard. And I need to look up a company called Meridian Holdings LLC, Ethan said, and anything connected to a man named Daniel Carver. Denny was quiet for a moment. Then this has something to do with those bikers, doesn't it? Yes, Ethan said. Is this dangerous? Ethan thought about Harper in the alley, pressing herself against a brick wall in a thin hoodie, in 7-degree cold, telling a stranger that people would kill her if they found her. He thought about 37 families. He thought about his father's signature, slightly wrong pen pressure that didn't match. I think it might be, he said honestly. Denny nodded slowly with the particular seriousness of a 19-year-old who has just been brought into something real. Okay, he said. I'll call my contact tonight. Ethan went back into the shop. He sat in the office chair behind the cluttered desk, and he looked at the card in his hand, and he thought about his father, Thomas Blake, who had worked that land with those rough hands, who had taught Ethan to listen to engines, and to people who had died without knowing that the people handling his affairs were not the people he thought they were. He pulled out his phone. He dialed the number on the card. It rang twice. Blake, said Grip's voice. You said a journalist and a financial analyst, Ethan said. When can I meet them? A pause, then how's tomorrow morning? Tomorrow morning works, Ethan said. He hung up the phone and sat for a moment in the quiet of the office with the creak of the shop around him and the cold pressing at the windows and the smell of his father's coat, which he was still wearing, which he hadn't taken off. He thought my father trusted the wrong people. He thought I'd been trusting the wrong story about what happened to him. He thought I found a scared girl in an alley and I gave her a coat and $20, and somehow that act has led me here to this desk, to this card, to a phone call that may be the beginning of the most difficult thing I have ever done. He thought there is a man named Daniel Carver in this city who has been doing this for years. 37 families, 37 sets of grieving people who trusted the wrong hands. He thought my father's name is on that list. And then Ethan Blake, who was 43 years old and tired and had $20 to his name last Monday, who ran a small shop that operated at the edge of its margins, who was neither powerful nor connected, nor particularly afraid of hard things, made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He was not going to walk past this. He never had been able to walk past anything that needed someone to stop. He pulled the card out of his pocket, again looked at the handwritten number, and then he put it carefully in the inner pocket of his father's coat, in the place where his father had always kept the things he meant to carry. He turned off the office light, and then he sat in the dark for a while and thought about what was coming, and about how sometimes the smallest acts, a coat, a $20 bill, a choice to turn into an alley instead of walking past, are the first links in a chain that turns out to be very long and very heavy and exactly what needed to be pulled. Ethan didn't sleep that night. He lay on his back in the dark of his apartment and stared at the ceiling and ran the numbers in his head the way he ran engine diagnostics methodically without panic, looking for the failure point. The Blake farm had sold for $210,000, appraised at $340,000, sold to a shell company that flipped it 8 weeks later for $380,000, $170,000. That was the gap. That was the money that had been extracted from his father's death like water wrung from a cloth. And somewhere in that gap was a loan. A loan his father had apparently taken out with his father's signature on it for money that had gone where Ethan had paid the estate attorney. He had signed the documents. He had trusted the process because his father was gone and he was grieving, and the men in suits with the official letterhead had told him this was how it worked, and he had been too wrecked to question it. He sat up at 4 a.m, turned on the lamp, and found the folder. He kept his father's estate documents in a manila folder in the bottom drawer of his bedroom dresser, underneath 2 sweaters and a copy of his lease. He pulled it out and spread everything on the kitchen table and looked at it the way he should have looked at it 14 months ago, not as a son trying to get through the worst paperwork of his life, but as a man looking for something wrong. The loan document was 3 pages. It was from a company called Cornerstone Asset Management, and it showed a principal balance of $95,000 against the farm property dated 8 months before his father had died. The signature at the bottom of each page was Thomas A. Blake, and Ethan sat with it under the lamp and looked at it for a long time. His father had never in his entire life signed his middle initial. His name on checks on tax returns, on the title of the truck he'd driven for 20 years, was always Thomas Blake. Never Thomas A. Blake. It was a small thing, the kind of thing you'd only know if you'd spent a lifetime watching the man sign his name. The kind of thing a forger would get wrong because they were working from official records that included the middle initial, not from the actual habit of the actual man. Ethan put the document down. His hands were steady. He was surprised by that. He picked up his phone and took photographs of every page. Then he put the folder back in the drawer, turned off the lamp, and sat at the kitchen table in the dark until it was time to go. The meeting was at a diner on the east side, not the Sunrise where he'd sent Harper a different one, a place called Della's, that opened at 6 and served coffee strong enough to sand paint. Grip was already there when Ethan arrived in a corner booth wearing a plain dark jacket over his vest. Across from him sat a woman Ethan didn't know. She stood when Ethan approached. She was in her early 40s, compact and sharp-featured, with the kind of energy that made you feel like the room had gotten slightly faster the moment she entered it. Claire Vasquez, she said, shaking his hand with a grip that meant it. I write for the Montana Independent, and I've been working this story for 11 months. 11 months, Ethan said, sitting down. Daniel Carver is very careful, she said, sliding back into the booth. Careful people take time. A second woman was coming through the door. Ethan saw Grip's eyes track her, and he turned. She was taller than Claire, mid-50s, carrying a leather document bag that was thick with paper. She had the particular composure of someone who spent their professional life in rooms where numbers were weapons and had gotten very good at fighting with them. Diane Pratt, she said, taking the seat beside Claire. Financial forensics. I've been the one looking at the paper trail. I found something last night, Ethan said before anyone else could speak. He pulled out his phone and showed them the photograph of the loan document. My father never signed his middle initial, not once in his entire life. This signature says Thomas A. Blake. Claire and Diane looked at each other. The look lasted less than a second, but it carried an entire conversation. That's consistent with what we found in 6 other cases, Diane said, pulling a folder from her bag with the efficiency of someone who has done this 1,000 times. The forger was working from official ID records, driver's license, property title documents, which all include the middle initial. The actual signatures from those individuals almost never do. She slid a sheet across the table to Ethan. These are 4 examples. Different families, different counties, same pattern. Ethan looked at the sheet. 4 signatures, all with the same issue middle initials that the actual signatories hadn't used in their real lives. 4 men who were dead. 4 families who had been told the debt was legitimate. Cornerstone Asset Management, he said. The company the loan is from. Is that real? It's registered in Delaware, Diane said, which is the corporate equivalent of a very dark closet. But we've traced the beneficial ownership through 3 layers of shell companies, and it connects back to a holding company that Daniel Carver has a controlling interest in. He lends money to himself, Ethan said slowly. He manufactures debt, Diane corrected. The loan never funds. The money never moves to the borrower. The document just exists to create a legal obligation that can be used to justify a forced sale at below market value. The estate can't clear title without satisfying the debt. The debt is owed to Carver's company. Carver's company accepts a deed in lieu of foreclosure, takes the property, sells it to a buyer who's already agreed to the deal, and splits the profit through a fee structure that looks like consulting expenses. Ethan sat with me for a moment. In the estate attorneys, some of them are unwitting, Claire said. Some of them are very witting. She opened her own notebook. The attorney who handled your father's estate man, named Gordon Price, has handled 11 of our 37 cases. That is not a coincidence. Gordon Price, Ethan said. He remembered the man. Silver-haired, soft-spoken, the kind of professional manner that read as competence and turned out to be theater. He remembered signing documents in that office. He remembered being offered water. He remembered thinking the man seemed kind. We have an email, Claire said, between Price and a senior associate at Carver's firm. It references your father's property specifically. It uses the word candidate. She slid a printed copy across the table. Ethan picked it up and read it. It was 3 sentences. The third sentence said, Blake Farm looks good. As a candidate, timeline fits. Let's move the cornerstone paper before the son has time to engage his own counsel. The son. That was him, before he had time to engage his own counsel. They had timed the paperwork to hit him while he was the most grief-shattered, the least likely to push back, the most likely to just sign and try to get through the worst of it. They had calculated his vulnerability and used it as a tool. Ethan set the email down carefully. His jaw was tight again. He breathed through it. How did Harper get access to this? He asked. Grip spoke for the first time since Ethan had arrived. He'd been watching the whole exchange with the patient attention of a man who had already processed all of this and was now watching someone else go through it for the first time. Harper has a friend, he said, a girl who works reception at Carver's firm, has worked there for 2 years. She started noticing documents that seemed wrong, names that came up repeatedly in contexts that didn't feel right. She started making copies. Not to expose anyone, she didn't even know what she had at first. Just because something felt off, and she was the kind of person who holds on to things when something feels off. What's her name? Ethan asked. We're keeping that out of the room for now, Grip said. For her protection. What matters is that she gave Harper a package of documents, internal communications, fee schedules, a list of properties. And that package is what Harper was carrying when Carver's people realized it was gone and sent someone after her. They sent someone after a 17-year-old girl, Ethan said. They sent 2 someones, Grip said. His voice was flat. She lost them in the warehouse district and ended up in that alley where you found her. The table was quiet for a moment. What does Carver know about me? Ethan asked. He knows you exist, Claire said. He knows you're Thomas Blake's son. He doesn't know yet that you've connected with us. But that window is going to close the moment someone in his network sees your name appear. In any kind of legal or investigative context, they'll know. How much time do we have? Ethan asked. That depends on what he does with the financial network in the next 72 hours, Diane said. He has a restructuring option. It's something we've seen in similar cases. When a target gets nervous, they dissolve the shell companies and reconstitute them under new structures, new beneficial owners, new registrations. If he does that, the paper trail we've built loses about 60% of its evidentiary value. The connections become much harder to prove. So we have 72 hours, Ethan said. Give or take, Claire said, which is why this morning matters. She leaned forward. Ethan, what I need from you, what this case needs is a lead plaintiff. Someone whose case is clean documented and has a human face that a jury can connect to. Your father's estate has all 3 of those things. The forged signature alone is significant. Combined with the price email, the shell company connection, and the below-market sale price, your father's case is the strongest individual example we have. A pause. I need you to be willing to stand in front of this. Ethan looked at her. You're asking me to be the face of a federal fraud case against a well-connected man who has already sent people after a teenage girl. Yes, Claire said simply. That's what I'm asking. What's the risk to me personally? Legal exposure, minimal. You're the victim, not the actor. Financial exposure, some litigation is expensive and slow, though we have a civil rights attorney who's agreed to take the lead case on contingency. Personal risk. She paused. Carver's people aren't violent as a rule. They're financial predators. Their weapons are paperwork and time, and the assumption that the people they've hurt don't have the resources to fight back. But when cornered, powerful men with resources do unpredictable things. That's not a no, Ethan said. That's an honest answer, Claire said. He thought about his father, about that email, about the word candidate, and about someone sitting in an office looking at Thomas Blake's property and his timeline and deciding that his son's grief was an exploitable condition. I need a day, he said. I need to look at all of this properly with my own eyes before I decide. That's fair, Grip said. But Ethan, he waited until Ethan was looking directly at him. I've been in a lot of rooms with a lot of men making a lot of decisions. The ones who need a day are usually the ones who've already decided. They just need the time to make peace with it. Ethan held the man's gaze. Maybe, he said. He took the copies Diane offered him, a carefully selected set of documents, nothing that would compromise the investigation's integrity, enough to let him understand the full picture of his father's case. He shook hands with Claire and Diane and walked out of Della's diner into the cold morning air. and he sat in his truck in the parking lot and went through every page. He didn't need the full day, but he took it anyway. Not because he was uncertain, but because this was not the kind of thing you entered without having sat with the weight of it fully. His father had deserved better than a rushed signature in a lawyer's office. This decision deserved better than a rush too. He called Denny at noon. Those records you pulled last night, the Meridian Holdings registration, the property title transfer timeline. Can you print all of it? Already did, Denny said. Ethan, the timeline on that property sale is insane. The deed transferred to Meridian Holdings on a Friday. By the following Monday, there was already a purchase agreement with the developer. That's not a sale that happened after the fact. That was arranged in advance. I know, Ethan said. I'll explain everything when I get in. There's something else, Denny said. His voice had changed, that specific tone of someone who has found something they weren't looking for. I was pulling the Cornerstone asset management filing, and I found something in the registered agent records. The registered agent for Cornerstone in Montana is a law firm. The law firm is Price and Associates. The attorney who handled the estate was also the registered agent for the company the fake loan came from. Gordon Price had been on both sides of the transaction simultaneously. He had guided Ethan through the paperwork that cleared a debt that ran through his own firm. Ethan sat in his truck and felt something cold and final settle through him. Not anger exactly, or not just anger, the feeling of a man who has been looking at a picture from the wrong angle and has suddenly tilted his head and seen what was actually there. Denny, he said, don't talk to anyone about this. Not yet. Not planning to, Denny said. He drove to the shop, looked at the printouts Denny had laid on the desk, confirmed what his assistant had found, and then he called the number Grip had given him. I don't need the full day, he said. I didn't think you would, Grip said. Price and Associates is the registered agent for Cornerstone Asset Management, Ethan said. In Montana, I just confirmed it through the Secretary of State's records. That's public. Anyone could have found it if they'd known to look. A pause on the line. We found it 6 weeks ago, Grip said. We were waiting to see if you'd find it yourself. People fight harder for what they discover than for what they're handed. Ethan processed that. You were testing me. I was finding out who you were, Grip said. The distinction was small but real. There's a difference. The meeting with Claire and Diane, Ethan said. When does that need to happen again? The formal one, the one where I actually commit to the case. Tonight if you're ready, Grip said. There's an attorney I want you to meet. Name is James Okafor, civil rights litigation 15 years. He's the one who takes this to federal court. Tonight, Ethan said, where Grip gave him an address. Not a diner this time, a private space and the kind of place where you could talk at full volume about things that weren't for the street. When Ethan arrived that evening, there was one person he hadn't expected in the room. Harper Hayes sat in the corner of the space with her arms folded across her chest and her father's leather jacket over her shoulders. And when she saw Ethan walk in, she stood up and looked at him with the dark eyes he'd seen in the alley. The same watchfulness, but something different behind it now. Not just fear, something that had developed since the alley, something that looked a lot like purpose. You came back, she said. I came back, he said. She crossed the room and stopped in front of him and looked at him for a long moment. And then she did something that he didn't expect. She put out her hand, formal and deliberate, and shook his like a colleague. I owe you more than a handshake, she said. You don't owe me anything, he said. I gave you a coat. You were carrying evidence that might get justice for 37 families, including mine. I think you're ahead on the debt. That made her smile, a real one this time, not the ghost of one. He saw now in better light and without the immediate overlay of crisis, very young and also very not young in the way of people who have moved through frightening things quickly. She had her father's directness, the same quality of saying the true thing without decoration. There's something I haven't told anyone yet, she said. I was waiting until I knew you were in. Grip from across the room, Harper. He's in, Dad, she said without turning around. Look at him. He was in before he walked through the door. She turned back to Ethan. The source inside Carver's office, the woman who's been copying documents. She told me something last week that I haven't put in any report yet because I needed to know who was going to be in this room before I said it out loud. The room had gone quiet. Claire, Diane, the attorney, Okafor, all of them watching Harper now. Ethan, Harper said, your father's case isn't just one of 37. It's the origin case. She paused, and the pause had weight. Carver built this entire system, the shell companies, the fake loan structure, the estate attorney network. He built it and tested it first on your father's property. The Blake farm was the proof of concept. Everything that came after, all 36 families after yours, all of it was built on what worked the first time. The room held the words. Ethan heard them and felt them, and then felt something shift underneath them. Not just grief, not just anger, but something with more structure to it. A understanding of scale. His father hadn't just been a victim. His father had been the first. The test, the template, and he was still alive, and he was standing in this room, and he had found a scared girl in an alley because he couldn't walk past something in distress. Okafor, he said, looking at the attorney who was watching him with careful professional attention. Tell me what I need to sign. Okafor opened his briefcase. He spoke for the next 40 minutes, measured precise, laying out the case structure, the risks, the timeline, the likelihood of federal pickup given the evidentiary foundation. He spoke the way a man speaks when he has done this work long enough to know which parts matter and which parts are noise, and he was ruthlessly economical with the noise. Ethan listened to every word with the same attention he gave to a troubled engine, not looking for what he wanted to hear, but for what was actually there. The case was strong. Not certain, nothing in litigation was certain, but built on a foundation that had been 11 months in the making by people who were very good at their jobs. When Okafor finished, Ethan picked up the pen. He signed 3 documents. His hand was steady. He thought about Thomas Blake, who had taught him that a man's word and a man's signature were the same thing, and that you did not put your name on anything you weren't willing to stand behind. He was willing to stand behind this. There's something Carver's people don't know yet, Claire said once the documents were signed. She pulled out her phone and pulled up a photograph, a man in his late 50s, prosperous looking, the groomed and careful appearance of someone who manages perception professionally. Carver is hosting a private financial conference here in Billings next week. Industry people, some local government connections, a couple of state legislators. It's the kind of event where he's very visible and very relaxed and very much presenting himself as legitimate. You're going to run the story at the conference, Ethan said. We're going to file the federal complaint and run the story simultaneously, Claire said, the day before the conference, so that every person walking into that room knows what the federal government thinks of their host. She looked at Ethan. Your name will be on the complaint. Your father's story will be the opening of the article. Are you ready for that? Ethan thought about what ready meant. He thought about how he'd stood in his father's kitchen the morning after the funeral and looked at the land through the window. The land that had been in the family for 3 decades, not knowing yet that by the time the estate closed, it would belong to a shell company that didn't really exist. I've been ready for 14 months, and he said, I just didn't have the right information. Grip stood and crossed to Ethan and put out his hand, and Ethan shook it, and the handshake lasted a moment longer than a purely formal handshake would have, the kind of duration that means something is being communicated that doesn't have words. One more thing, Grip said quietly. Carver knows Harper exists. He knows she had documents. He doesn't know yet what she gave us or whether it's usable, but he's going to start pushing harder to find out, which means the people around Harper need to be careful. And the people around Ethan, Claire said. Carver's people don't do violence, Okafor said in the tone of a man making a legal note. They do intimidation, legal threats, financial pressure, discrediting. Those are their instruments. Then we better be faster than their instruments, Ethan said. Harper, who had been quiet since her revelation, spoke from across the room. There's something else in the documents, she said. Something I haven't fully processed yet. A list not of properties, but of people. People inside the system. Some of them are names you'd recognize. Some of them are in this city. How far up does it go? Claire asked. I don't know yet, Harper said. That's what I'm still working through. The room absorbed that. The implications were not small. If Carver's network extended to recognizable names to people with institutional authority, then the filing of a federal complaint wouldn't just shake a financial predator. It would shake something larger. Ethan drove home that night through the empty streets of Billings, wearing his father's coat, with the window cracked and the cold coming in the way it does in Montana in November, clean and absolute. He thought about the meeting, about the documents, about Harper's face when she'd said origin case with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent weeks turning a horror over in their hands until they understood its shape completely. He thought about the word candidate in that email, about someone calculating the timing of his grief. He thought about a man named Daniel Carver who was hosting a conference next week, smiling at legislators, presenting himself as a legitimate member of the business community, while 40 miles away, a mechanic in a used coat was making peace with the fact that he was about to become the most consequential thing he had ever been. He parked in front of his apartment building and then sat for a moment with the engine off. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. 6 words, no punctuation, no context. You should have kept walking, Blake. He stared at it for a long time. Then he took a screenshot, sent it to Claire's number and typed, "They know I'm involved." She responded in under a minute. "Good. That means we're moving fast enough to scare them. Don't respond. See you tomorrow." He put the phone in his pocket and got out of the truck. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold and looked up at the sky the way his father used to, head tilted back, jaw up, like a man measuring the weather before a long day's work. Then he went inside. There was a lot of work to do. The anonymous text sat in Ethan's phone like a splinter he couldn't stop touching. He'd screenshotted it, sent it to Claire, done everything right, but the 6 words kept coming back to him in the quiet moments while he was under a chassis, while he was pouring coffee, while he was lying awake at 2 in the morning, listening to the apartment buildings settle around him. You should have kept walking, Blake. Someone had his number. Someone knew his name and knew he'd made a choice and wanted him to understand that the choice had been noted. He didn't change his routine. That was deliberate. Grip had told him the morning after the text to keep doing exactly what he always did. Open the shop at 7, close at 6, take the same route home. The moment you change your pattern, Grip said, you tell them their message landed. Don't give them that. So Ethan opened at 7 and closed at 6 and took the same route home, and he felt the awareness of being watched the way you feel a weather change before it arrives. Not in anything specific, just in the pressure of the air. Claire called on the 3rd morning with a question that changed the shape of everything. "I need you to look at something," she said without preamble, which was her way. "Can you come to my office at noon?" "What is it?" "I'd rather show you than describe it," she said. "It'll land differently on paper." He was there at 5 to 12. Claire's office at the Montana Independent was a controlled chaos of printed documents, annotated printouts, and coffee cups that suggested she had not been sleeping in any responsible way. Diane Pratt was already there sitting at the side table with her laptop, and she looked up when Ethan came in with the expression of someone who has been waiting to have a difficult conversation and is relieved the other person has finally arrived. Claire did not waste time. She turned her monitor to face him and pointed. "This is the full list Harper referenced at the meeting. The one she said she was still working through. She finished working through it last night and sent it to me at 1 in the morning." Ethan looked at the screen. It was a spreadsheet, clean and organized, the kind of document that had been assembled by someone with a methodical mind and an understanding of what would be needed to make it legible to someone else. Column headers: name, role, relationship to Carver network, benefit received, documentation reference. There were 42 names on the list. He scanned them. Most meant nothing to him, financial industry names, people from firms he didn't know. But 3 names stopped him cold. The first was a county assessor whose office had handled property valuations on 11 of the 37 affected estates. The second was a state banking regulator whose division would have had oversight authority over exactly the kind of loan instruments Cornerstone Asset Management had been manufacturing. The third name he recognized, not from any professional context, but from a yard sign he had driven past for years, a local alderman who had been in office for 12 years and whose name was on a community center 2 blocks from Ethan's shop. "He has people inside the regulatory structure," Ethan said. The assessor's office was undervaluing the properties on paper. Diane said, pulling up a second window on her laptop. "Look at the assessed values on record versus the actual market appraisals. On your father's farm alone, the assessed value was marked 22% below what an independent appraiser confirmed. That below-market assessment made the forced sale look cleaner, made the numbers look less wrong than they were." "And the banking regulator," Ethan said. 3 complaints were filed against Cornerstone Asset Management over the past 4 years, Claire said, by families who noticed something wrong with their estate paperwork. All 3 complaints were closed without investigation. The regulator on the list was the reviewing official on all 3. Ethan sat down in the chair across from Claire's desk. He looked at the screen and he thought about the architecture of what had been built here, not just a financial scheme, but a scaffolding around a financial scheme designed to make it invisible from every direction that scrutiny might come from. An assessor to make the numbers look clean, a regulator to close the complaints, an attorney network to manage the paperwork, shell companies to launder the trail. This had not been put together quickly. This had been assembled over years by someone who thought systemically, who understood that a predatory scheme without institutional protection was just a crime waiting to be caught, and who had taken the time to buy or compromise every layer of protection that might have caught it. Carver's smart, Ethan said. He's very smart, Claire confirmed, which is why it took 11 months and a teenager with a thumb drive to break it open. How did Harper's source get access to the list? She processed the external correspondence for the firm, Claire said, including communications between Carver and his network contacts. She wasn't supposed to retain copies she was supposed to process and delete. She retained. A pause. She's been doing it for 14 months, since before your father's estate even closed. Ethan looked at her. 14 months. She started copying documents at the same time my father's estate was being processed. Within weeks of it, yes. Claire's expression was careful. She won't tell us what specifically triggered it. She just says something felt wrong and she started keeping records. We think it may have been your father's, something in it that she processed that crossed a line for her personally. But she hasn't confirmed that, and we're not pushing her. A woman he'd never met working a reception desk in a building he'd never entered had looked at something connected to his father's death and decided to start fighting it. Had spent 14 months making quiet copies and holding on to them at personal risk without knowing if anyone would ever see them or care. He sat with that for a moment. The weight of it was strange, not just the risk she'd taken, but the fact that she'd taken it alone in silence without knowing if it would matter, because something had crossed a line for her, and she hadn't been able to just continue as if it hadn't. I need to meet her, he said. That's not possible right now, Claire said. Her safety depends on Carver's people not knowing she's the source. If you meet her and you're being watched, I know, he said. I understand. He stopped. There wasn't a sentence for what he meant. He meant, tell her I know. Tell her I understand what 14 months of that kind of quiet courage costs. Tell her it mattered. Tell her the documents are being used, he said. Tell her they're going to matter. She knows, Claire said quietly. Harper told her. He exhaled. Then he pulled his chair forward and looked at the list on the screen. What's the plan with the names the assessor and the regulator? Are they in the federal complaint? That's what we need to discuss, Diane said. She closed her laptop and gave Ethan her full attention, which had the quality of a searchlight coming to bear. Adding regulatory officials to the complaint escalates the scope significantly. It moves this from financial fraud to potential public corruption. That's a different category of federal attention, the kind that brings in the FBI's public corruption unit rather than just financial crimes. Is that good or bad? Ethan asked. It's slower and louder, she said. The investigation becomes more complex. The resources increase, but so does the timeline. Carver's attorneys will use the complexity to buy time, and the more time they have, the more they can structure around what we found. But the evidence is stronger, Ethan said. The evidence is significantly stronger, she confirmed. A standalone financial fraud case has maybe a 60% chance of producing convictions at trial. A public corruption case with this level of documented network coordination, if the federal prosecutors take it seriously, and with what we have, they would have to, you're looking at a case that would be very difficult to defend against. Ethan turned to Claire. What does Okafor say? He says go full scope, Claire said. He says the worst thing we could do right now is show Carver's people that we know less than we know. We have the list. We have the correspondence. We have 14 months of documented source material. Filing a limited complaint would be playing small when we're holding a full hand. Then we file full scope, Ethan said. There's a risk to you specifically, Diane said. Adding the regulatory officials means this becomes political in a way it currently isn't. You will be named as the lead plaintiff in a complaint that alleges public corruption involving a sitting county official and a state banking regulator. Those people have resources and networks and institutional incentives to discredit you. They already sent a text to my phone 3 days ago telling me I should have kept walking, Ethan said. I think the discrediting was coming regardless. Claire looked at him steadily. Yes, she said, it was. Then let's not give them the comfort of thinking we're afraid of it, he said. The room held that for a moment, and then Claire picked up her pen and made a note, and Diane reopened her laptop, and the meeting moved forward with the particular momentum of a decision that has been made and does not need to be revisited. Okafor joined by phone 40 minutes later. He spoke for 12 minutes laying out the amended complaint structure, and when he finished, he asked Ethan directly, "You understand that your name is now attached to allegations involving public officials who have every incentive to retaliate through legal means." "I understand," Ethan said. "And you're prepared to stand as the lead plaintiff through what will likely be a 12 to 18-month federal process that will at various points be uncomfortable, public, and financially draining, even with contingency representation." "My father worked that land for 30 years, Ethan said. "I'll stand in front of it for 18 months. A pause on the line. Then Okafor said, "All right, I'll have the amended filing ready for review by Friday." After the call ended, Claire sat back in her chair and looked at Ethan with the expression of a journalist who has been in enough rooms to know what different kinds of commitment look like. "Can I ask you something personal?" "Go ahead," he said. "The night you found Harper, you didn't know any of this. You didn't know about the documents about Carver, about your father's estate being connected to anything larger. You just saw a scared girl in an alley." "That's right," he said. "And you still stopped." "Yes." "Why?" she said. And she wasn't asking it rhetorically. She was asking it the way a journalist asks a question when they genuinely want the answer, when the answer is going to go in a story and they want it to be true. Ethan thought about it for a moment, about the sound he'd heard in the alley, the specific silence of something hiding, about the decision that had taken no deliberation. "My father used to say he started and then he stopped because the word father still did something to his chest that required a brief pause. He used to say that you could tell everything about a man's character by what he does when there's nothing in it for him, when nobody's watching and there's no benefit, and the easiest thing is to just walk past." He looked at Claire. "I guess I was trying to be the kind of man my father thought I was." Claire wrote that down. She wrote it down carefully, the way she wrote things down when she was sure they were going to matter. They reconvened that evening, the full group, same private space as before. Grip was there with two of his senior men, both of whom had been introduced to Ethan the previous day, and whom he was beginning to understand were not merely intimidating presences, but men with specific skills and specific roles in the investigation's protective architecture. Harper was there again this time with a laptop open and a set of printed pages in a folder that she handled with the careful attention of someone who has spent days getting very familiar with difficult material. She had something new. "I've been through the full correspondence set," she said. She spoke with a directness that was more her father's than her own age's, the kind of directness that came from having spent the last weeks handling things that required it. "There are references in the Carver to network communications to something they call the clearance window. It's a term they use internally for the period after someone dies and before their estate fully closes the gap where documents can be inserted. Debts can be manufactured, paperwork can be processed through compliant attorneys without the heirs having enough legal sophistication to catch it. The clearance window," Diane said with the tone of someone who is filing a term away for future use in a courtroom. "They have a checklist," Harper said. She opened the folder and slid copies around the table. "For each target property, I found it in the correspondence. It's referenced as the CW protocol, 14 steps. Step 1 is confirming time of death and initiating probate monitoring. Step 7 is cornerstone paper insertion. Step 11 is assessor coordination. Step 14 is sale close and profit distribution." Ethan looked at the copy in front of him. 14 steps. The bureaucracy of theft laid out with the organized efficiency of a real estate transaction checklist. Step 7, cornerstone paper insertion. Someone had done step 7 on his father's estate, had sat at a desk and checked a box. "This is the document that breaks it open completely," Okafor said from across the table. He had come in person this time, and he was holding the checklist with the focused attention of a man who has been waiting for exactly this piece. "This is internal documentation of a systematic protocol. This isn't one-off fraud. This is an organized criminal enterprise with a documented methodology. Under RICO statute, this changes the entire character of the prosecution. RICO, Claire said, and it wasn't a question. She was already writing. Racketeer-influenced and corrupt organizations, Okafor said. It requires demonstrating a pattern of criminal activity through an organized enterprise. This checklist, combined with the 37 documented cases and the regulatory network on the list, this is RICO. He set the document down. This also means federal mandatory minimums apply to everyone in the network, not just Carver. The table was quiet. The assessor and the regulator, Grips said slowly. Under RICO, Okafor confirmed, which is why their attorneys, when they find out, and they will find out the moment we file, are going to be strongly motivated to consider cooperation agreements. He paused. The first person inside that network to cooperate meaningfully with federal prosecutors gets a very different outcome than everyone who waits. Can we use that? Claire asked. We're not prosecutors, Okafor said. We can't offer plea deals. But the complaint becomes public the moment it is filed, and every person named in it will have access to a lawyer who can read what RICO exposure means for their client's future. We create the pressure, Diane said. The pressure creates the cooperation. The cooperation creates the full evidentiary picture. Yes, Okafor said. Ethan was looking at the CW protocol checklist. He was on step 7, the one that referred to his father's estate. Cornerstone paper insertion. His father's name had been on a checklist. Someone had gone down the list step by step and done each thing and checked each box, and his father had been a task to be completed rather than a man who had lived and worked and died. Carver is going to run, Ethan said. Everyone looked at him. When we file, he said, he's smart. He's been doing this for years. He has resources. When the complaint drops and the conference is the next day, he's going to understand immediately what the scope is. A man who built this kind of system and kept it running this long is not going to sit still and wait to be arrested. You think he'll move assets and relocate, Claire said. I think he's probably already moving assets, Ethan said. That text to my phone 3 days ago, that wasn't just intimidation. That was a man checking whether I was actually committed, trying to get a read on whether the threat was real. He's been in preparation mode since Harper's documents went missing. We're not the only ones in a 72-hour window. The room absorbed that, Grip spoke, which means we need something that moves faster than a federal filing. The story, Claire said. She looked at Grip, then at Ethan. If I publish the story before the complaint is filed, not the full legal piece, but the human story, the Blake farm, the 37 families, the CW protocol, it creates a public record that can't be restructured away. Assets can be moved. Shell companies can be dissolved. But a story in print with named sources and documented methodology that's permanent. You'd be running ahead of the legal action, Okafor said carefully. I'd be running parallel to it, she said. The complaint and the story go simultaneously. That was always the plan. I'm suggesting we move the timeline up by 48 hours. File and publish before Carver's conference rather than the day before. Give him less time to prepare a public response. 48 hours from now, Diane said. Can you have the story ready? It's been ready for 3 weeks, Claire said. I've been waiting on a lead plaintiff. Now I have one. She looked at Ethan. Your father's story is the opening. Your story, the alley, the coat finding Harper connecting to the investigation, that's the through line. I need you to be willing to be fully named and fully quoted. I understand, Ethan said. There's something else, Harper said. She hadn't spoken since laying out the CW protocol, and the room had almost forgotten she was still thinking. That was a quality she had. She could go quiet in a way that made her temporarily invisible, and then she said something that reoriented everything. Carver's source lists the people in his network. It's not just the assessor and the regulator. She paused. There's a fourth name, one I held back because I wasn't sure how to contextualize it. She looked at her father. It's a judge. The word landed in the room like a stone dropped in still water. Grip's expression didn't change, which was its own kind of response, the reaction of a man who has disciplined himself to absorb shocks without showing them. Okafor set down his pen. Which judge? District Court, Harper said. Family and Probate Division. Probate, the division that oversaw estate closings. The judge whose court would have been the institutional backstop, the final oversight layer for the very transactions Carver had been running through compliant attorneys. Has he presided over any of the 37 estates? Diane asked, her voice very controlled. 11 of them, Harper said. 11 estates, 11 families whose paperwork had passed through the court of a judge who was on Carver's network list as a relationship contact with documented benefits received. What benefits? Okafor asked. Harper looked at her folder. Cash payments described in the correspondence as consulting engagements, routed through a third shell company not previously identified in the investigation, totaling across 4 years approximately $340,000. $340,000, the exact appraised value of the Blake farm to the dollar. Ethan noticed that and said nothing because some coincidences weren't coincidences, and this one was the kind that made his jaw tight again. A sitting district court judge, Claire said quietly. She was not writing. She was looking at Harper with the expression of a journalist who has just been handed the most important sentence of her career and is holding it carefully the way you hold something that might break. Yes, Harper said. This changes the story, Claire said. This is no longer a fraud case. This is systemic corruption at every institutional level that should have caught it. This is why they sent people after her, Grip said. His voice was very quiet and very controlled in the specific way of a man who is not quiet by nature. Not just because of the financial exposure, because of him. A sitting judge on a network list with $340,000 of documented payments. If that name became public, every probate proceeding he had overseen in 4 years was potentially compromised. Every estate, every family who had come before his court. The institutional fallout would extend far beyond Carver's 37 targets. Ethan looked at Harper across the table. She was 17 years old and she had spent the last 2 weeks parsing through the most dangerous set of documents in Billings, Montana, and she was sitting in a folding chair with her father's jacket over her shoulders, and she looked tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing and is only just beginning to pass it to hands that can carry it. You've been sitting on a judge's name, he said. I didn't know if the group was ready for it, she said simply. Are we ready for it? He asked Okafor. The attorney looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way of a man running calculations that have no clean answer. Then he looked back at Ethan. Adding a federal judge to a RICO complaint moves this to the Department of Justice's Public Integrity section, he said. It elevates the case to a level that guarantees federal resources and federal attention. It also makes it impossible to suppress or sideline at the local level because the local level is now part of what's being indicted. A pause. It also makes every person named in the complaint significantly more motivated to act against you before the filing becomes public. We include it, Ethan said. He didn't look at anyone else when he said it. He said it in the same tone he used when he decided to close his father's estate lawyer's office door and trust the man in the suit, except this time he was moving in the opposite direction, from that trust in the direction of the thing that had been done in its name. Grip looked at him. You're sure? My father came before that court, Ethan said. His estate closed through that courtroom. If that judge was in Carver's pocket when my father's paperwork crossed his desk, he stopped. Started again. We include it. Nobody argued. Okafor called 2 of his colleagues federal specialists, people whose names he said quietly into the phone in the hallway without putting them on speaker, and came back into the room 20 minutes later with a different quality of focus. My colleagues agree on the RICO framing, he said. They're going to contact the FBI's Public Corruption Unit tonight. Not to file yet, to brief them informally on the scope. The federal complaint will still come from us, but the FBI needs time to prepare for the scale of what's coming. How long does that give Carver? Claire asked. 40 hours at the outside, Okafor said. We file and publish simultaneously at 8 in the morning day after tomorrow. That's the window. 40 hours, Grip said. 40 hours, Okafor confirmed. The meeting broke. People moved, gathered papers, made calls, departed with the focused efficiency of a team that knows exactly what it needs to do in the time it has. Ethan found himself standing beside Grip in the quiet after most of the room had emptied. A judge, Grip said. Not to anyone in particular, just putting it in the air. Yeah, Ethan said. You know what this means, our Grip said. Every one of those families, the 11 who went through his courtroom, they have grounds to challenge what happened to their estates. The legal remedies become much larger. I know, Ethan said. Some of those people lost farms that have been in their families for generations, Grip said. Land that can't be unbought. Money that was spent years ago. His voice was carefully level, but there was something underneath it, the specific pain of someone who understands what it means to have something irreplaceable taken through a system you should have been able to trust. The money can be recovered. Some of it, but not all of it. Not the time. No, Ethan said, not the time. They stood together in the quiet. Why are you doing this? Ethan asked. Not the abstract reason, the personal one. You clearly have resources and capability, and you could have found a different way to go at Carver. A way that didn't involve journalists and federal complaints and a mechanic from Billings. Grip was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, he chose his words with the care of a man who doesn't often speak about the things that cost him. 5 years ago, he said, one of my men lost his mother. She was 81 years old. She'd owned a small piece of land outside of Great Falls since 1972. When she died, the estate process took that land for a debt she apparently owed to Cornerstone Asset Management. He paused. She never took a loan in her life. She was 81 years old and she'd lived debt-free since 1985, and she had never heard of Cornerstone Asset Management. Another pause. My man, he's a big person in the way that people look at someone like him and they see the leather and the patches and they make a decision about what he is. The estate attorney treated him like a problem to manage rather than a son who lost his mother. The court process moved around him rather than including him. The system that was supposed to protect his family treated his family's grief as a vulnerability to exploit. He stopped. I'm sorry, Ethan said. When Harper started finding things, Grip said, and the names on the documents started matching the names we'd been looking at for 5 years. He shook his head. You play the long game when you have to. You wait for the evidence. You build the coalition. And then when a mechanic in a worn-out canvas coat turns into a corner alley on a cold night and changes the whole shape of the case by doing one decent thing. He looked at Ethan. You make sure that man knows what he's part of. Ethan thought about the alley, about Harper pressing herself against the brick wall, about the decision that took no deliberation. I just turned into an alley, Stanley said, or as Grip said. You did. They shook hands again. This time it was briefer, the handshake of two men who have already said the important thing and don't need to ornament it. Ethan drove home in the dark. He parked and sat for a moment, as he had become accustomed to doing, just sitting in the quiet before going in. His phone had been silent since the anonymous text. He didn't know if that was better or worse than activity. He went inside and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with his father's estate folder spread in front of him again. He'd looked at these documents a dozen times now, and each time he found something new, not because the documents changed, but because his ability to read them had changed. He knew now what he was looking at. He knew the vocabulary of the fraud. He could see with the forensic eye he'd developed over the past week exactly how each step of the CW protocol had been applied to his father's file. Step 7. Cornerstone paper insertion. He found the exact document, the loan agreement. 3 pages, Thomas A. Blake's signature on each page, the middle initial that his father had never used. He sat and looked at it for a long time. Then he took out a piece of paper, not his phone, not his laptop, just a plain piece of paper, the way his father would have done it, and he wrote a letter. He wasn't sure who it was to yet. Maybe to himself, maybe to no one. Maybe to his father, which was an irrational thing that he didn't care about because there was no rational framework adequate to what he was feeling. He wrote, I found out what happened to your land. I'm not going to let it stay buried. I know it doesn't change anything for you, but it changes something for me. And I think it changes something for the other families too. And I think you would have wanted it changed. He folded the paper and put it in the inside pocket of his father's coat next to Grip's original card. Then he went to bed and slept for 6 hours, which was the most uninterrupted sleep he'd gotten since the night he'd walked home without his coat and turned into an alley and found a terrified girl and changed the direction of his life. 40 hours. Ethan's phone rang at 5:40 in the morning, 2 hours before he'd planned to be awake. It was Okafor. The attorney's voice had a quality Ethan hadn't heard from him before, for not panic nothing as disorganized as panic, but the accelerated precision of a man who has received information that requires immediate recalibration. We have a problem, he said. Get dressed. I need you at Claire's office in 30 minutes. What happened? Ethan said. He was already sitting up, already reaching for his clothes. Carver moved last night, Okafor said. I'll explain when you get there. He was at the Montana Independent in 22 minutes. Claire was at her desk looking like she hadn't slept, which she probably hadn't with 3 monitors running and a phone pressed between her shoulder and her ear that she dropped into its cradle the moment Ethan walked in. Diane was already there. Grip was there, standing against the back wall with his arms crossed in an expression that was absolutely unreadable, which somehow communicated more than an expression would have. Harper was not there. "Where's Harper?" Ethan asked, and the question landed with a weight that stilled the room for a half second. "She's secure," Grip said. "She's with 2 of my people. She won't be coming to meetings for a while." The phrasing was specific enough to be alarming. "What happened?" Ethan said again. Claire answered. "At 11:15 last night, Cornerstone Asset Management filed a voluntary dissolution with the Delaware Secretary of State. At 11:43, related shell entities, including Meridian Holdings, filed the same. At 12:08, a 4th entity that Diane's team identified only 4 days ago also dissolved." She paused. "He's burning the corporate structure." "The paper trail," Ethan said. "The dissolving of entities doesn't destroy the documentation we already have," Diane said quickly. "Our copies, the source's copies, the correspondence Harper extracted, none of that disappears because he files paperwork. What it does is complicate the tracing of current assets. Money that was held inside those entities becomes harder to attach through standard civil forfeiture channels." "He's moving money," Ethan said. "He dissolved 4 companies in 53 minutes in the middle of the night," Diane said. "That is not a man who is still deciding whether to run. That is a man who made that decision days ago and has been executing it in stages." "The conference," Grip said from the wall. "He's still scheduled to host it. Registration is still open. His office hasn't announced any cancellation." "Because canceling it would confirm something's wrong," Claire said. "He needs to look normal for another 36 hours while he finishes moving assets and positions himself." "For what?" Ethan asked. Okafor answered. "Our best estimate is that he intends to be outside of federal jurisdiction before the complaint is filed. He has a business interest in Canada, a legitimate one, a consulting firm in Calgary that predates the fraud operation. If he establishes physical presence there, before we file extradition, becomes the mechanism rather than arrest and extradition between the U.S. and Canada, while generally functional, is slow and procedurally complex." "How slow?" Ethan said. "Months. Potentially longer if his attorneys file challenges." "So he walks out to Calgary and waits," Ethan said. "With his assets restructured into instruments that are harder to freeze," Diane said. "Yes." Ethan stood in the middle of Claire's office and looked at the monitors and felt the shape of the problem with the same analytical clarity he applied to a broken engine. The moving parts were clear. The failure point was time. Carver had less of it than he thought 2 days ago, and he knew it, and he was acting on it, which meant the 40-hour window they'd been working toward had just compressed. "How much time do we actually have?" he asked. "If we file today," Okafor said, "the assets that haven't moved yet can potentially be frozen through emergency civil attachment. The federal prosecutors I spoke with last night, when I called them at 1 in the morning about this, they said if the complaint lands on their desks before close of business today, they can move on a temporary restraining order against asset transfer by end of day. That stops him from moving the remaining money." "Today," Ethan said. "Today," Okafor confirmed, "which means the story runs today too, simultaneously, as we planned just 36 hours earlier than planned." Everyone looked at Claire. She was already pulling up the file on her center monitor. "The story has been ready for 3 weeks, she said. "I told you that. I wasn't overstating it." She looked at Ethan. "I need you to read it before it publishes. You're the lead source. You have right of review." She turned the monitor toward him. He read it standing up, which was not how you usually read something that was about your father, but there was no time for the posture of grief. The story was 1,200 words, lean and controlled, the way Claire wrote everything with a clarity that made it land harder rather than softer. It opened with Thomas Blake. It described the farm, the estate, the loan that had never existed, the signature with the wrong middle initial. It described Ethan finding Harper in the alley, giving her the coat and the $20, the arrival of the motorcycles. It described the investigation, the 37 families, the CW protocol, the assessor, the regulator, the judge. It named all of them by name except the judge who was identified as a sitting district court judge in the probate division, pending the complaint being filed with his name explicitly included. It was the kind of story that would not be forgotten. Ethan read it twice. When he looked up, the room was watching him. The last paragraph, he said. Claire looked at her screen. The last paragraph read, Ethan Blake, a 43-year-old mechanic, didn't turn into that alley because he knew what he'd find. He turned into it because it was the right thing to do, in the same way that his father worked that land for 30 years because it was the right thing to do. What was done to Thomas Blake's estate was done by men who calculated that grief was exploitable and that a working man's trust was a weakness to be monetized. They were wrong. It turns out that the son of a man like Thomas Blake is exactly the kind of man who doesn't walk past something that needs someone to stop. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You wrote this before you knew me, he said. I wrote the placeholder, Claire said. I filled in the details after I knew you. A pause. Is it accurate? Yes, he said. Run it. The next 4 hours were the most concentrated of Ethan's life. Okafor and his federal colleagues coordinated the complaint filing, which at its amended scope ran to 63 pages and named 17 individuals. Carver, the network attorneys, including Price, the assessor, the state banking regulator, the district court judge, and 11 other peripheral contacts from the correspondence. The RICO framing was explicit. The CW protocol was attached as Exhibit A. Diane spent those hours preparing the financial documentation package for the federal prosecutors, a summary exhibit set that translated the forensic accounting into language a jury could follow, which was a skill that required making complexity legible without making it simple, and she was very good at it. Grip made calls. He did not explain to Ethan who he was calling or why, but over the course of the morning, 3 things happened that Ethan would later understand were the results of those calls. A local television news crew appeared outside Carver's office building and began filming without explanation. 2 members of the Montana state legislature, who were not on Carver's network list, were briefed confidentially by a source Ethan couldn't identify, and a retired FBI special agent who now worked as a private investigator confirmed through channels Grip didn't name that Carver had not yet crossed the Canadian border. He's still here, Grip said at 9:15. Still in Billings. For how long? Ethan asked. Unknown. His car left his residence at 7:30 this morning. His assistant called 3 conference vendors to confirm tomorrow's setup. He's maintaining the appearance. Until he doesn't, Ethan said. Until he doesn't, Grip agreed. At 10:40, Ethan's phone rang. It was a number he didn't know, different from the anonymous text, a full 10-digit number with a Billings area code. He almost didn't answer it. Then he thought about what kind of man doesn't answer the phone when things are in motion, and he answered it. Mr. Blake. The voice was smooth, measured with the particular quality of someone who has spent their professional life sounding reasonable in situations that weren't. My name is Richard Sallow. I represent Daniel Carver. Ethan said nothing. I wonder if you'd be willing to have a brief conversation, Sallow said. Before certain actions are taken, that would be difficult to walk back for everyone involved. I'm listening, Ethan said. He was already walking toward Claire, pointing at the phone, mouthing the word Carver. She was moving immediately, pulling out her own phone, calling Okafor. My client is aware of the investigation that has been assembled, Sallow said. He's also aware of your personal circumstances, the shop, the financial situation, the complexity of what you've been through since your father passed. He asked me to convey that he believes there may be room for a resolution that would address the concerns of all parties without the damaging and costly process of federal litigation. He wants to buy me off, Ethan said. A brief pause. He wants to explore whether the legitimate interests of the Blake estate can be addressed through a direct settlement that would be, my father's land was taken through a manufactured debt and a forged signature, Ethan said. 37 families lost property the same way. A county assessor helped it look legal. A state banking regulator closed the complaints that could have stopped it. A sitting district court judge signed off on estates that came through his courtroom after receiving $340,000 in payments routed through a shell company. He paused. What's the settlement number that makes all of that go away, Mr. Sallow? I'm genuinely curious. The silence on the line lasted 4 seconds, long enough to confirm that Sallow had not expected the full scope to be in Ethan's possession. I see you've been thorough, Sallow said finally. My father was a thorough man, Ethan said. I learned from him. Mr. Blake, federal litigation is slow, expensive, and uncertain, even with strong evidence. Then your client should have thought about that before he put my father's name on a checklist, Ethan said. We're filing today. The story runs with it. I don't have anything else to say to you. He hung up. His hand was absolutely steady. Claire was looking at him. He called you directly. Through his attorney, Ethan said. He's testing whether I can be moved. Can you? She asked. It wasn't a challenging question. It was a reporter's question, checking the factual answer. No, he said. She nodded once and went back to her monitors. At 11:50, Okafor called. The complaint is filed, he said. His voice had the particular quality of a man setting down something very heavy upon after carrying it for a long time. Federal District Court Billings Division. The prosecutors have it. They're moving on the asset attachment order. Ethan sat down for the first time in 4 hours. It's in the system, Okafor said. It can't be unfiled. Whatever happens next happens from a position where the record exists. Thank you, Ethan said. Don't thank me yet, Okafor said, though not unkindly. This is where it gets complicated. The story went live at noon. Claire sent a single text to Ethan when she hit publish. It's up. That was all. He pulled it up on his phone and read it again this time, knowing it was real and public and attached to his name in a permanent way. He read his father's name in the second paragraph and held the phone and breathed. Denny called 20 minutes later. Ethan, there are like 40 news alerts going off in here. Is this you? Is this the thing with the Hells Angels and the motorcycles? Yes, Ethan said. It's me. Oh man, Denny said. He sounded simultaneously stunned and impressed, which was about the right response. Are you okay? I'm okay, Ethan said. Do you need me to come wherever you are? No, open the shop. Normal day. I'll be in this afternoon. Normal day, Denny said in the tone of someone for whom this was not a normal day, and hung up. The calls and texts that followed over the next 2 hours were a kind of controlled avalanche. 3 of the 37 families' people who had been contacted by Okafor's team in advance and briefed on the filing called Ethan directly because Okafor had given them his number with his permission. These were brief calls, each one difficult in its own way. An older woman named Patricia Osgood, whose husband's cattle ranch outside of Lewistown had been processed through the CEDU protocol 4 years earlier, who started the call, composed and ended it crying not from sadness, but from the particular release of someone who has been told finally that what they suspected was true, and that someone was going to stand up in front of it. A man named George Farrow, 68, former school teacher, whose mother's property had gone to Meridian Holdings, who said nothing for the first 15 seconds of the call, and then said, I knew it. I couldn't prove it, and nobody would listen. But I knew it. A couple, the Hendersons, not the Hendersons, whose truck he'd been working on, a different family entirely, who had lost a small orchard property, and who called together from the same phone, both of their voices in the line, and simply said, thank you for being willing to put your name on it. Each call cost something. Each one also gave something back that was different from what it cost, a weight that had been sitting on his chest since the morning after his father's funeral. The specific heaviness of a wrong that couldn't be named, that gradually became lighter. Each time another person on the line confirmed that the wrong had been real and was now being addressed. At 2 in the afternoon, the news broke that Daniel Carver had not appeared at his office and was not responding to his assistant's calls. His car had been spotted at the Billings-Logan International Airport at 11:10 that morning, 40 minutes before the complaint was filed. Ethan heard this from Grip, who called with the flatness of someone delivering information they had expected. He tried to run, Grip said. The federal prosecutors had an alert on his passport. He was stopped at the gate. Stopped how? Ethan said. Federal agents, Grip said. Apparently they moved faster than Salo expected them to move when they saw the scope of the complaint. A pause. He's in federal custody. Voluntary surrender was requested and he complied. He's not been formally arrested yet. He's being interviewed. Ethan sat with them. Daniel Carver, who had sat in an office and looked at his father's name and selected it and built a system around it and run that system for years and compromised officials and corrupted a judge and sent people after a 17-year-old girl was sitting in a room right now being asked questions he didn't want to answer. His attorney is already there, Grip added. Salo, the one who called you. Good, Ethan said. Let them talk to each other. There was something that might have been satisfaction in Grip's voice when he responded brief and controlled. Yes, he said. Let them. At 3:30, a development happened that nobody had planned for, and that changed the emotional character of the day entirely. Okafor called. The banking regulator, the one on Harper's list. His personal attorney called the federal prosecutor's office 2 hours ago requesting a proffer session. He wants to cooperate, Ethan said. He wants to negotiate terms for cooperation, Okafor clarified in the tone of a man who is precise about the distinction. He hasn't committed to anything, but the fact that he called within 3 hours of the complaint becoming public, he scared people with something to trade move fast. What does he have to trade? Ethan asked. We don't know yet, Okafor said. But a regulator with 4 years of internal knowledge of Carver's operation, if he cooperates fully, could fill significant gaps in the evidentiary picture, particularly around the judge. The judge, the probate judge whose name was in the complaint as a contact with documented payments, but who had not yet been formally named in press coverage because of the layers of judicial protection that surrounded sitting judges even in the context of federal criminal allegations. The regulator can connect the judge directly, Ethan said. If he was present for or privy to the communications, Okafor said, which given his role in the network, he very likely was. Another pause. Ethan, I want to be careful about building expectations. Cooperation proffer sessions are preliminary. He may offer something valuable or he may offer very little. We won't know for several days. But he called, Ethan said. He called, Okafor said, within 3 hours. That meant the pressure was working. The structure Carver had built, the assessor, the regulator, the judge, the attorneys, was not a structure of loyal allies. It was a structure of people who had been paid for specific services and who, when the payment structure collapsed and the exposure became real, and the federal investigators started moving, would make rational calculations about their own futures. The cooperation of any single one of them opened a door into the full picture that no amount of corporate dissolution could close. Ethan went to the shop at 4 o'clock. He had told Denny he'd be there, and he intended to be there because routine mattered, and because there were 2 cars that needed work, and because standing in his own shop doing the work he knew how to do was on a day like this something grounding and necessary. Denny was behind the front desk when he came in, and he looked up with the expression of someone who had been processing a lot of information all day and was relieved to have something concrete in front of him. The Henderson truck is done, he said. The Alvarez transmission is going to be another 2 days. That's fine, Ethan said. I'll call them. There was a woman here, Denny said carefully, about an hour ago. She didn't leave her name. She came in and asked if you were here, and when I said you weren't, she said to tell you thank you. That was it. She left. Ethan looked at Denny. What did she look like? 50s maybe, well-dressed. She looked like she'd been crying recently, but wasn't anymore. Denny paused. She was holding a folder, like a document folder. She didn't leave it. Ethan thought about a woman who had spent 14 months at a reception desk making quiet copies of documents that crossed a line for her, holding on to them without knowing if they would matter, and who had now seen the story run and the complaint filed and understood that they had mattered enormously. Who had come to the shop of the man whose father's file had started her 14 months of quiet courage and had said thank you through an intermediary because she couldn't yet be seen in public connection with any of it. Okay, he said quietly. Do you know who she was? Denny asked. I think so, Ethan said. It's okay. He went into the bay and got under the Alvarez transmission and worked for 2 hours in the particular piece of physical work that requires complete attention and rewards it with the satisfaction of a thing going from broken to functional. The work did what it always did. It organized him. It gave his hands something real to do while his mind processed the enormous and complicated thing that the day had been. He was still under the car when his phone buzzed. A text from Claire. The story has been picked up by AP Wire. It's national. He set the phone down on the concrete floor next to him and looked at the undercarriage of the Alvarez vehicle and thought about his father, who had never in his life sought attention from anyone, who had worked his land and fixed his fences and lived as straight a line as a man could live, and whose name was now in a story that was moving across the country. He thought, I hope you can see this from wherever you are. He picked up his wrench and kept working. At 6:15, as he was locking the shop, Grip pulled up on his motorcycle. Just Grip alone, which was unusual enough to register. He sat on the bike and didn't dismount, and Ethan walked over to him and stood. "She's ready to come in from the cold," Grip said. Ethan understood immediately. "Harper, she's been sitting on one more thing," Grip said. "Something she didn't tell the room. She told me this afternoon, and I told her it was her decision when and how to bring it forward." He paused. "She wants to tell you first. Before Okafor, before Claire, before anyone. She said you've earned the right to hear it first." "When?" Ethan said. "Tonight if you're willing." "Tell me where," Ethan said. Grip gave him an address, a quiet house on the east side, the kind of residential street where nobody paid particular attention to unfamiliar cars. He was there at 7:30. Harper was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She wasn't drinking, and she looked up when he came in with Grip, and she had the expression of someone who has been deciding for a long time and has finished deciding. "Sit down," she said. He sat. She put a single page on the table between them. A printout, a section of internal correspondence, formatted the same as the other documents in her collection. She slid it across to him and watched his face as he read it. It was an email, internal to Carver's organization, dated 22 months ago, 6 months before Thomas Blake had died. The subject line was Blake Acquisition Timeline Dependency. The body of the email discussed the Blake Farm property in the context of a larger acquisition plan. It referenced the property's valuation, its debt-free status, its suitability as a CW protocol candidate. And then in the third paragraph, it referenced the anticipated timeline for the property to become available. The anticipated timeline was predicated on Thomas Blake's projected mortality. Ethan read that sentence twice. Then he set the page down and looked at the far wall for a moment. His father had been sick. He'd had a diagnosis, heart disease, the kind that moves at a predictable pace, the kind where a doctor can give you a range of years that turns out to be accurate. Ethan had known about the illness. His father had known. It had been in the terrible logic of that last year, something they had all been quietly preparing for. What he had not known until this moment was that Carver's organization had also known. Had known and had included Thomas Blake's projected death in their acquisition planning, and had begun preparing the corporate paperwork, the manufactured loan, the shell company structure, the assessor coordination, before Thomas Blake had died while he was still alive, with the cold, forward-looking efficiency of predators who don't wait for their opportunity, but schedule it. They were ready before he died, Ethan said. His voice was level. It cost him something to keep it level. "The cornerstone loan document was backdated," Harper said quietly. "The actual preparation of the forged paperwork, based on the correspondence, began approximately 4 months before your father's death. They were watching the illness. They were timing the execution around it." He sat with that. "This is the part I wasn't sure how to give anyone," Harper said, "because it's not just fraud anymore. Depending on how the federal prosecutors interpret the coordination around your father's illness and death, there may be additional charges beyond RICO. The deliberate targeting of a dying man, the coordination around his projected mortality as an acquisition event. They treated his death as a business opportunity," Ethan said. "Yes," she said. "I'm sorry." He looked at the page again, then he looked at Harper. She was 17 years old and she was sitting across from him, having just handed him the single most painful piece of information he had received in a year. Full of painful information, and she was watching him with her father's steadiness and her own particular form of courage, which was the courage of someone young enough to still be learning how heavy things can be and bearing it anyway. "You've been carrying this for how long?" he asked. "Since Thursday," she said, "when I finished the full correspondence review." 4 days, he said. "I wanted to make sure I understood it correctly before I said it to anyone," she said. "I kept reading it and rereading it, hoping I was misreading it." A pause. "I wasn't." He reached out and put the page face down on the table because he needed a moment of not looking at it. He breathed carefully, the kind of breathing you do when you're deciding whether the weight of something is going to knock you down or not. It was not going to knock him down. He had decided that already in the same wordless way. He decided to turn into the alley in the same place below logic where the important decisions lived. "Add it to the complaint," he said. "Tell Okafor tonight. This goes in." Grip, standing behind Harper with his arms crossed, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, an exhale that carried the weight of a man watching another man absorb something hard and stay standing. "Ethan," Harper said, "are you okay?" "No," he said honestly, "but that's not the question that matters right now." What's the question that matters right now? She asked. He picked up the page and folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his father's coat, next to the letter he had written and next to Grip's original card. 3 pieces of paper in the pocket where his father had always kept the things he meant to carry. The question that matters, he said, is how fast we can get this to Okafor. Okafor picked up on the first ring. It was 7:43 in the evening, and Ethan was still sitting at the kitchen table in the East Side house with Harper across from him and Grip standing behind her. And when Okafor answered, Ethan didn't waste any time. Harper has a supplemental document, he said. It changes the character of the charges. You need to see it tonight. A beat. How significantly does it change things? They knew my father was dying, Ethan said. They built the acquisition timeline around his illness. The forged paperwork was prepared 4 months before he died. They were scheduling around his projected mortality. The silence on Okafor's end lasted exactly 3 seconds. I'm coming to you, he said. Send me the address. He was there in 18 minutes. He read the email twice standing at the table, and when he set it down, his expression had the particular quality of a man who has spent 15 years in civil rights litigation and has learned to contain his reactions, but is finding containment difficult. This moves us from RICO into territory that federal prosecutors are going to want to pursue very aggressively, he said. The deliberate targeting of a terminally ill individual, the coordination of fraud execution around projected time of death, there are statutes that speak directly to predatory schemes targeting vulnerable individuals. Combined with the RICO framing, this is, he paused. This is a significantly stronger case than the one we filed this morning. Can we amend the complaint? Ethan asked. We can file a supplemental exhibit, Okafor said. Tonight. The federal court's electronic filing system runs 24 hours. I can have the supplemental in the record before midnight. He was already on his phone calling his office. This also changes the cooperation calculus for the regulator. He said half to the room and half to himself. When his attorney sees this, the proffer session tomorrow becomes much more urgent for his client. Because the charges are worse than he thought, Grip said. Because the charges are significantly worse than he thought, Okafor confirmed. A regulator who helped close complaints against a company that was deliberately targeting dying men for property fraud, that is a different conversation than the one his attorney prepared for this afternoon. Harper was watching Okafor with the focused attention she brought to everything, the quality of someone cataloging each piece of information in real time. There's something else in the correspondence set that connects to this, she said. I flagged it but didn't include it in the printout because I wasn't sure of its relevance. Now I think it's relevant. Tell me, Okafor said. There are references in 3 separate emails to something they called patient files, she said. It's a term used in the internal correspondence for individuals who had been identified as CW protocol candidates based on publicly available health information, obituary patterns, Medicare records accessed through a contact social media post from family members about illness. She paused. They had a monitoring system for sick people with terminal diagnoses whose properties met their acquisition criteria. They were watching them and waiting. The room held that. A monitoring system, Claire said. She had arrived 10 minutes after Okafor called by Grip, and she was standing near the door with her notebook open and the particular stillness of a journalist who has just heard the sentence that makes a story into something historic. They were actively surveilling terminally ill property owners. Through Medicare records, Diane said. She had come with Claire, and she said the words with the flat precision of someone who understands exactly what unauthorized access to federal health records means in a legal context. That's not a financial crime anymore. That's a federal privacy violation on top of the fraud and the RICO. That's multiple agencies. How many names in the patient files? Okafor asked Harper. I counted references to approximately 60 individual files, Harper said. The 37 documented cases are a subset. There were others that were being monitored who died before the scheme was fully operational or whose estates closed in ways that didn't provide an opportunity. And there are current files, people who are still alive, still being watched, still on the list. The sentence landed with the force of a door swinging open onto a much larger room than anyone had expected. There are active targets, Ethan said. Yes, Harper said. People who are sick right now, he said, whose names are in files in Carver's system. who don't know they're being watched. Yes, she said again. Ethan stood up. The chair scraped back, and he stood, and he looked at Okafor, and the look contained everything that needed to be said without needing to say it. This can't wait for the standard filing process, he said. If Carver is in federal custody and his operation is in the process of collapsing, whoever is managing those active files is going to either run or start cleaning house. Those people, the ones who are still alive and still being monitored, they need to be identified and warned. That requires the FBI to move on the patient files specifically, Okafor said. Tonight, he was already dialing. What followed was an hour that Ethan experienced as a series of sharp consecutive developments that left no space between them. Okafor on the phone with federal prosecutors who escalated to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, who had already been briefed on the complaint and were not unprepared, but were now recalibrating their response posture based on the patient file revelation. Diane on her laptop pulling every reference to the Medicare contact mentioned in the correspondence, building a supplemental financial exhibit that identified the specific access points. Claire on her phone with her editor because the story that had gone national at noon was now a different and larger story, and the Montana Independent was going to need to update it before morning. Grip stepped outside to make calls Ethan couldn't hear. He came back 15 minutes later and said 2 words, "It's moving." Ethan didn't ask what specifically was moving. He understood that Grip operated through channels that were adjacent to the official ones. Not illegal, not in opposition, but running parallel in ways that sometimes move faster and sometimes reach places that official channels couldn't reach in time. He had learned to trust that the movement was in the right direction. At 10:15, Okafor came back into the kitchen from the hallway where he'd been on the phone for 40 minutes and sat down with the particular heaviness of someone who has been running hard and has just crossed the finish line of one race in order to begin another. The FBI is formally opening a separate investigation into the patient file surveillance, he said. It will run parallel to the RICO prosecution. The Medicare contact the person inside the system who was providing access to the health records. The FBI has identified them based on the correspondence references and will be interviewing them tonight. The active targets, Ethan asked. The FBI is working to identify them from the files that were seized from Carver's office when he was taken into custody this afternoon, Okafor said. His office was searched under an emergency warrant that the prosecutors filed when the patient file information came in. There are physical files in that office. A pause. They found them. They're going through them now. Ethan sat back. Somewhere in Billings tonight, federal agents were going through filing cabinets in an office building, pulling folders with sick people's names on them, beginning the process of reaching those people or their families to tell them that the thing they didn't know was happening to them had been stopped. He thought about his father, about the folder in that system with Thomas Blake's name on it, about someone sitting in a comfortable office looking at his father's diagnosis and calculating the timeline. He thought about all the things his father had never known, and about the fact that he would never be able to tell him what had been found, and that the telling would have to happen in a different way, through the public record, through the complaint, through the cases that would be argued in federal court with Thomas Blake's name as the origin point. Ethan, Harper's voice was quiet from across the table. He looked at her. She was watching him with an expression that was for the first time in all the days since the alley not waited with the immediate urgency of the next thing. The next thing had been handed off to the people and institutions equipped to carry it. What remained in the space that created was something more personal and harder to name. "How are you doing?" she asked. Not the version of the question that means, "Are you operationally functional?" The real version. "I'm okay," he said. And then because she deserved the honest answer, "I will be." She nodded. She understood the distinction. "I keep thinking about the fact that you turned into that alley," she said. "That specific night, I'd been running for 6 hours. I was in 4 different places before that alley, and I left each one because I heard something or saw something that scared me. That alley was the 5th place. I was so cold I couldn't think straight. I decided I was just going to stay there until morning and figure it out when the sun came up." She looked at her hands. "If you'd walked past, if you'd done the rational thing and kept going, I don't know what would have happened to the documents. I had them in my bag, but I was barely functional. I might have made a bad decision. I might have tried to move again and run into the people who were looking for me. But I didn't walk past, Ethan said. No, she said. You didn't. She looked up at him. Why didn't you? I've been thinking about it since that night. You had no reason to stop. It was late, it was cold, you were tired. The rational calculation was to keep walking. He thought about how to answer that, about his father's voice, about the lesson that lived below logic. Because the sound I heard in that alley was the sound of something hiding, he said. And I was raised to stop when I hear that. Because a thing that's hiding is usually a thing that needs help, and I can't walk past something that needs help. I've tried, I'm not built for it. Harper looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, My dad said you were the most dangerous kind of good man. Ethan blinked. Dangerous? He meant it as a compliment, she said. He said most good men are good in circumstances that don't cost them anything. The dangerous kind are good when it costs everything, because you can't predict them, you can't buy them, and you can't scare them off. A pause. He's not wrong. Grip came back into the room at that moment as if he'd heard his name, and he looked at his daughter and then at Ethan and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, the conference. Carver's conference, Claire said, tomorrow. It's still on the books, Grip said. His assistant hasn't canceled it because she's not authorized to make that decision, and there's no one above her left to make it. The venue is still set up, the catering is still ordered, and approximately 200 people, financial industry contacts, legislators, local officials are still planning to attend an event hosted by a man who is currently in federal custody. He paused. Claire. Claire looked at him. Yes. I think someone should be there tomorrow, Grip said, when the 200 people walk in and find out. Claire was already reaching for her phone. What happened at the Billings Financial Conference the following morning was, depending on your perspective, either a collapse or a revelation. The guests arrived in the ordinary way of people attending an industry event, parking their cars, making small talk, checking their phones for messages. The catering staff were setting up. The venue was prepared. And then in the lobby, on the large display screen that had been programmed to show a welcome message from Daniel Carver, someone from the venue's technical team, acting on instructions from the FBI, which had a warrant covering Carver's event assets, had replaced the welcome message with a single line of text directing attendees to visit the Montana Independent's website for important information about their host. Claire was in the lobby when the first guests started reading their phones. She described it to Ethan afterward. The specific progression of expression on people's faces as they read the story, the confusion giving way to comprehension, giving way to a kind of whitening of pallor that spread through the room as professional men and women in expensive conference attire began to understand that they had been associating themselves with something that was now the subject of a federal RICO prosecution, a congressional data privacy inquiry, and an FBI investigation into the surveillance of terminally ill property owners. 3 of the attendees were people whose names Ethan recognized from Harper's list, peripheral network contacts, not primary actors, but recipients of benefits that were now a matter of federal record. Claire watched each of them read the story on their phones. She watched each of them make a phone call immediately after. She documented all of it. The state legislator, who was not on Carver's list, one of the 2 who Grip's contact had briefed confidentially the day before, issued a public statement by 9 in the morning calling for a state-level investigation into the regulatory failures that had allowed the scheme to operate for 4 years. The statement named the banking regulator by name. The banking regulator's attorney called Okafor's office 40 minutes later to confirm that his client was ready to proceed with a full cooperation agreement. The cooperation session happened that afternoon. Ethan wasn't in the room, but Okafor called him at 4:15 with a voice that had a quality Ethan hadn't heard from him before, the specific satisfaction of a man who has spent a career doing difficult work and has just received confirmation that the difficult work was worth it. He gave us the judge, Okafor said. Direct. He was present for 2 conversations between Carver and the judge regarding specific estates. He can testify to both. He also confirmed the Medicare contact and identified 2 additional network attorneys we hadn't previously identified. The judge, Ethan said, the court will be notified today, Okafor said. He'll be placed on administrative leave pending the federal investigation. The 11 estates that passed through his courtroom are being flagged for review. Any family whose case he presided over has grounds for a challenge. 11 more families. 11 more sets of people who would receive a phone call or a letter in the coming days telling them that the process they had trusted the court that was supposed to protect them had been compromised, that what had felt wrong had been wrong, that someone was going to stand in front of it. Gordon Price, Ethan said, the estate attorney. He was served this morning, Okafor said. His license has been voluntarily surrendered pending the Bar Association's review, which his attorney agreed to as a condition of opening a cooperation discussion. He's not going to fight this. There's nothing to fight with. One by one, the architecture of the thing his father had been fed into was coming apart, not violently, not dramatically, but with the systematic thoroughness of a structure whose load-bearing elements have been removed. Price surrendering his license. The regulator cooperating, the judge on administrative leave, the shell companies dissolved by Carver's own panicked hand before he'd realized that the dissolution created its own evidentiary record rather than erasing the previous one. Carver himself remained in federal custody. His attorney Sallow had filed for bail, which had been denied on flight risk grounds given the airport incident. He was being held and interviewed, and the interviews were, according to Okafor's federal contacts, not going well for Daniel Carver, because a man whose entire network is in the process of cooperating against him has very little left to offer in exchange for leniency and very little left to hide behind. The call Ethan received the following morning, 2 days after the filing, 3 days after Carver had tried to board a plane to Calgary, was from a number he didn't know with a Montana area code. And when he answered it, there was a woman's voice on the line. Not young, steady, but with something beneath the steadiness that was the residue of a very long time of being afraid. "Mr. Blake," she said, "my name is, I'd rather not say my name yet, but I think you know who I am." He knew. "Yes," he said quietly. "I came to your shop 2 days ago," she said. "Your young assistant told you I was there." "He did. I've been at that firm for 3 years," she said. "I processed the Blake file, your father's file." A pause. "I want you to know that I understood what I was looking at when I processed it. I understood that the numbers didn't make sense and that the signature didn't look right and that the company the loan came from was connected to the firm in a way it shouldn't have been." Another pause. "I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't have the authority or the standing I didn't know what to do. So I started keeping records because it was the only thing I could do, and I thought maybe someday someone would know what to do with them." "They did," Ethan said. "Harper knew what to do with them." "Yes," the woman said. "She's remarkable, that girl." "She is," he agreed. "I wanted to tell you something about your father's file," she said. "When I processed it, when I typed the correspondence and prepared the documents, there was a photograph attached. In the original property file, it was a photograph of the farm, just the land, no people. Rolling fields, a fence line, mountains in the background. Someone in the file assembly had included it as part of the property documentation." She paused. "It was beautiful. I remember thinking whoever worked this land loved it. You could see it in the photograph. It was land that had been cared for." A longer pause. "I'm sorry I couldn't stop what happened to it sooner. I'm sorry I didn't know how." "You did everything you could do," Ethan said. "You kept the records. That's what mattered." "Will it be enough?" she asked. "In the end, for the families." "I don't know yet," he said honestly, "but we're going to find out." She thanked him and hung up, and he sat for a while with the phone in his hand and thought about a woman who had processed his father's file and looked at a photograph of a field and known that something was being stolen and spent 14 months holding the evidence until someone came along who knew what to do with it. That was its own kind of courage. The invisible kind, the kind that didn't get stories written about it, that operated in silence, that held on without knowing if the holding on would matter. It had mattered. 3 weeks after the filing, Ethan received a letter from the federal court. The civil attachment order on Carver's remaining assets had been granted in full. The total value of the attached assets, bank accounts, investment instruments, real property held in Carver's personal name, and in the final shell entities that hadn't been dissolved before the arrest was $4.3 million. The letter from Okafor that arrived the same day explained that the civil case would move to seek a portion of that figure as compensatory damages for the documented victims. The process would be long. The amount each family ultimately received would depend on the full scope of the damages calculation and the outcome of the criminal prosecution. But the money existed was frozen and was being held by the court for exactly this purpose. Ethan sat at his kitchen table and read that number 4.3 million and thought about 37 families and about the Blake farm selling for $210,000 when it was worth $340 and about a $170,000 gap that had been extracted from his father's death like water from a cloth. The money wasn't the point. It had never been the point. But it was evidence of the point evidence that what had been taken was real and had real value, and that the system, when pushed hard enough and pointed in the right direction by the right people, was capable of trying to give it back. The day Okafor called to tell him that Daniel Carver had entered a guilty plea, not to the full RACO indictment which went to trial, but to the core fraud charges as part of a plea agreement that still carried a sentencing range of 8 to 12 years, Ethan was under a car. He took the call lying on his back on the creeper, with the transmission above him and the smell of oil around him, and he listened to Okafor's controlled and professional delivery of the information with his eyes on the undercarriage and his mind on something much further away. 8 to 12 years, he said. Minimum 8 under the agreement, Okafor said. The criminal trial on the remaining RICO counts continues. The plea covers the core fraud. The patient file surveillance and the Medicare access charges are being handled by a separate federal prosecution. The judge, Ethan asked. Federal grand jury returned an indictment last week, Okafor said. He stepped down from the bench. The 11 estates are under formal judicial review. A pause. Price lost his license. The assessor resigned and is cooperating. The regulator received a reduced sentence recommendation in exchange for his testimony. He paused again. Ethan, the case your father's estate made possible, I want you to understand the scale of this. The CW protocol documentation alone has triggered investigations in 3 states. The patient file surveillance has led to a federal legislative proposal on property protection for terminally ill individuals. This doesn't end with Daniel Carver's plea. This becomes the case that changes the legislation. Ethan was quiet for a moment. My father would have found that very uncomfortable, he said. He didn't like attention. I know, Okafor said. And he said it in a way that meant he did know that in 15 months of working this case, he had come to know Thomas Blake through his documents and his land, and his son the way you come to know someone through the impression they leave on everything they touched. But I think he would have liked the outcome. Yes, Ethan said. I think he would have. He slid out from under the car and sat up on the creeper and looked at the shop around him, the tools on their hooks, the cars in the bays, Denny whistling something off-key in the office, the blue sign above the door that said Blake Automotive in the letters Ethan had repainted himself 5 years ago because the paint was peeling and he wasn't willing to let his father's name look shabby. His phone buzzed. A text from Harper heard the news. How are you? He typed back. Good, Dan. You. Her response came immediately, better every day. Dad says hi. Also, he wants to know if you want to come to dinner Sunday. I told him you'd probably say yes. He smiled at that. He typed, tell him yes. She sent back a single thumbs up, and then after a second text, thank you for turning into that alley. He looked at that for a moment. Then he typed, thank you for being in it. He put the phone in his pocket and stood up and reached for his wrench. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, which was the thing about a life like his, a life built on the premise that things broke and needed fixing, and that the fixing was worth doing carefully and well. He had a transmission to finish a truck, to inspect a call to make to Mrs. Carlisle about her overdue oil change that she was going to take personally, regardless of how he framed it. He thought about his father, about a man who had worked a piece of land for 30 years with rough hands and a straight back, and the bedrock conviction that a man's character was built in the moments when there was nothing in it for him. About the farm which was gone and couldn't be unbought, and about the money that the court was holding and would distribute to 37 families, and which was not the farm, but was the acknowledgement that the farm had mattered, that Thomas Blake had mattered, that what had been done to him was wrong, and that the wrongness had been named and was being addressed in the full light of public record and federal law. About a photograph in a film, rolling fields of fence line, mountains behind it, that a woman at a reception desk had looked at and known in the wordless way that people sometimes know things, that it was land that had been loved. It had been loved. That was real. That couldn't be taken. He thought about Harper in the alley, pressing herself against the bricks, and about the decision that took no deliberation, and about the coat that was still on his shoulders, his father's coat, the one with the cracked leather collar, and the small repair in dark thread, and the smell of pipe tobacco that nothing had ever quite washed out, and about how the smallest things are sometimes the first link in a chain that turns out to be very long and very important and exactly what was needed. He put his wrench to the bolt, and he turned it firm and sure, the way his father had taught him, no hesitation, no second guessing, just the confidence of a man who knows his work and does it right. Some things once broken could be fixed. You just had to be willing to stop and do the work. You had to be the kind of man who didn't walk past. Ethan Blake was exactly that kind of man, and because of it, 37 families were no longer alone in the dark. A system built on predatory silence had been dragged into the light, and a girl who had pressed herself against a cold brick wall in a Montana alley now walked without looking over her shoulder. That was what one decent man doing one decent thing on one cold November night had made possible. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.